Hey, go ahead and have a seat and turn in your Bibles to the book of Genesis. We're back there. Genesis chapter 30 is where we're going to be at this morning. Charles Vance Millar was a prominent lawyer that lived in the area of Toronto, Canada. He was single, he had no kids, and he was a guy who loved to play practical jokes and pranks. On his death, or at his death in 1926, they opened up his will to find some interesting bequeaths, if that is a word. I don't know, strange as it may sound. For example, there was 3 guys who hated each other. They were all lawyers, and he bequeathed to them his summer home in Jamaica that they would have to share together. There was another 3 guys who were part of an anti-horse racing committee, and he decided to bequeath to them $25,000 of Ontario Horse Jockey Club stock. Just to, I just love playing practical jokes, but the biggest and the most outlandish practical joke, or I don't know if it would be a practical joke, was when it was open, they found that he had bequeathed to the woman, any woman in the city of Toronto, who for the next 10 years would bear the most kids. He would give them $500,000. At the time, in 1936, it would be the equivalent today of $8.4 million. And so what transpired after that is known as the Great Stork Derby. Now, I'm not lying. This is true. And women everywhere began to see how many kids they could multiply. And certain family names became household things. The media got behind it, and it was kind of a household name of who's winning out, who's doing this. In the end, after 10 years, and they had to be legitimate kids and all these hoops you kind of had to jump through, but it was established. People tried to tear it down in the court, and him being a lawyer knew exactly what people would do, and so he set things straight. In the end, after 10 years, there were 4 women who tied with 9 kids apiece. And they split the money, $125,000 apiece, the equivalent today of, obviously, of $2.1 million. Crazy as it may seem. Why did he do it? And he wrote in his will this. He said, "I have no dependents or near relations, and no duty rests upon me to leave any property at my death. And what I do leave is proof of my folly in gathering and retaining more than I required in my lifetime." He did it because he could. Well, in chapter 30 here, as we study this, we see somewhat of a great stork derby with the wives and handmaids of Jacob and the amount of children that becomes a competition, a game, as they begin to play these things to produce the most kids. And so we find even today that people play games in their marriages and in their families, games of expectation, of manipulation, of self-indulgence. There's all these games. And we also play games in our workplace to try to gain the upper hand. And that kind of summarizes what's going on here in chapter 30. But follow along with me. It says there, when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister and said to Jacob, "Give me children or else I die." And Jacob's anger was aroused against Rachel, and he said, "Am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?" So she said, "Here is my maid Bilhah. Go into her, and she will bear a child on my knees, that I also may have children by her." And she gave him to Bilhah, her maid, as wife, and Jacob went in to her. Now, Jacob had 2 wives, Rachel and Leah, as we studied about previously. And Leah at this time has 4 children. Rachel has none. And there's this tension that arises within the family. Talk about dysfunctional family. I mean, he put the dis in dysfunctional, you might say. You can easily just elbow your wife or husband and go, "Listen, we are not this bad. There's hope for us." But check it out. She begins to have some issues. Some mistakes are made. And we find in verse 1, the first mistake is that her affections towards her sister Leah, she began to envy her. She began to envy her sister, jealous of her state. She's got 4 kids. Rachel's got none. And in that culture, in that place, to not bear a son was a curse. Secondly, her accusations upon her husband, give me children or I die. I think there was something there, And here she began to blame him. It's a desperation cry. Leah, interesting, ironically, Leah is despised and yet she's fruitful. Rachel is loved and yet she's unfruitful. And I think how often we can always look at others and say, oh, if only I was in their shoes. And we all say it. If only I had what they had. Oh, if only I had their health. Why am I like this? And if I could just be better, why do they get this? Don't get this. Why are they pretty and I'm plain? Why are they bearing kids and I'm not bearing any? And there's always something to look at with others and be a little jealous of. And in that jealousy, the heart turns in kind of a blaming way towards the ones that we love the most, accusing them of things that are out of their control. Give me or else. It's the threats of manipulation. It's the accusations of, it's your fault. It's the claims and the things of the foolish games and the challenges and the blame games and the unrealistic expectations that we put upon even our spouse. Life's not fair, and it's because of you, is what Rachel is saying. If he would just, if she would just, maybe you're the problem of why I'm barren spiritually. Maybe you've said that. Look at what Jacob does in verse 2. He basically says, am I in the place of God? Listen, the problem's not with me, he says. I've got 4 kids by Leah. God has withheld the fruit of your womb. God's the one that's in control. What am I supposed to do? And, at times we really have to stop and ask ourselves, are we looking to get from others what they never are intended to give, so to speak? That they are somehow responsible to fix my spiritual barrenness, and if it's not met, then something's wrong with them. And we got to say, well, no, maybe something's wrong with me. And all of a sudden, we get the bitter heart, and it easily leads to blaming words, and we begin to cause this rift in relationships and marriages and friendships and fellowship and all those things because it's all their fault, and I'm the victim here. James 3:16 tells us that where envy and self-seeking exist, which was what was happening in Rachel's heart, confusion and every evil thing are there. But Rachel makes a third mistake, and we see that in verse 3, is her accommodation to fix it. Instead of turning to the Lord and saying, God, could you please help? She accused her husband. Instead of saying, Jacob, let's stop and let's pray. I'm just really super frustrated with this whole thing. No, she says, you know what? God's not working in my timetable, in my way, and so I'm going to fix it myself. Here is my handmaid. Take her and have a child by her, and she will be mine. Now, doesn't that ring a bell somewhere along the road that they tried this before in the family line? Well, there in Genesis 16, Sarah said the same thing in her barrenness. Take Hagar, Abraham, and she will have a baby, and I will raise him up. And, of course, we know what happened there. It was total frustration and the work of the flesh and have serious repercussions. But culturally, this was how they did it. If you didn't have a kid, and it was such a curse to bear that you would, in a sense, do surrogate parenting. And that was just a common thing of the day. But I don't think it was the right thing to do. You see, guys, God will allow barrenness in your life at times, simply that you look to Him and not others to meet the need. When the job dries up, do you end up pointing the fingers and blaming the boss and accusing so-and-so because of actions? Or are you looking to the Lord to say, God, sovereignly, you're in control here? When the relationship goes south, it just falls apart, When those things happen, do you find yourself looking to others or looking to the Lord? Rachel needed to do that. I think at those times when we're noticing a barrenness, it's best to just stop and wait and listen to the Lord for what he wants to say. In verse 4, it tells us that she gave Bilhah to her maid and as a wife, and Jacob went into her. And obviously Jacob isn't off the hook either. He agrees to it. He's not listening to the Lord very well, and it's causing problems. Verse 5, and Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. And Rachel said, God has judged my case, and he has also heard my voice and given me a son. Therefore she called his name Dan, and Dan means judge. And she basically says, in your face, Leah, God is my judge, and I am vindicated, and she now is mine, and God's hearing my plea. But was she really right? And there's times we got to stop and say, Lord, I may get what I want, but is it really honorable to you? Is it really honorable to you? The children of Israel were there in the wilderness, and they began to test and tempt God, and God tells us in Psalms 106, he gave them their heart's desire, but sent leanness into their soul. Let me tell you what, it's better to have a full soul than a fat belly. And there's times when we got to say, Lord, if it's not going to honor you, I don't want it. It's not the right route, Lord. I'm going to do what's honoring to you. Verse 7 and 8, and Rachel's maid Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. And then Rachel said, with great wrestling I have wrestled with my sister, and indeed I have prevailed. So she called his name Naphtali, and that means wrestling. She said, aha, I am taking you out. Advantage me. But she's still down 4-2. She's not really winning the game here. In verse 9, then Leah saw that she had stopped bearing. She took Zilpah, her maid, and gave her to Jacob as wife. And Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a son, and Leah said, a troop comes. So she called his name Gad. And Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. And Leah said, I am happy, for the daughters will call me blessed. So she called his name Asher. She basically said, Rachel, two can play at this game. Watch what I can do. And there she takes her handmaid and gives her to Jacob. And Zilpah bears these two kids. Gad means a troop, because I think Leah is saying, hey, the army is coming and the war is on, girlfriend. And we are going to have a cat fight over this issue. And she says, second son comes, and she says, happy, happy, happy. It's all good for me. And they're just digging at each other through this, and calls his name Asher there. Ultimately, they've made their marriage a competition rather than the completion that God meant it to be. It's all about leverage rather than love, and guess who are the tools in the mix of it? The kids. Sound familiar even today is what happens. I think it's quite interesting that Jacob has nothing to say in the matter here. What's wrong with this guy? I don't know if he's just trying to keep the peace in the household or what, but he seems to be simply a man after the flesh right now, and he's not rebuking anything or suggesting anything, not leading his family spiritually. The score at the end of the first half is simply Leah has 6, 4 by her, 2 by her handmaid Zilpah, and Team Rachel only has 2. But the game's not over. Verse 14. Now Reuben went in the days of wheat harvest and found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, please give me some of your son's mandrakes. But she said to her, is it a small matter that you've taken away my husband? Would you also take away my son's mandrakes also? And Rachel said, therefore, he will lie with you tonight for your son's mandrakes. And you look at this, and here comes the second half of the game. Plan B comes into place. You might call these the demand drakes, because that's really what's happening here. What are these mandrakes? In Hebrew, they are called love apples. And the thought of the day was that these rare and highly valued fruits were some sort of aphrodisiac that caused also women to not be fertile or infertile. They caused them to be fertile, somehow assisted in that. And of course, Leah has stopped bearing kids for a while. Her son Reuben finds these, and she says, yes, I'm back, back in the ball game. This is good, and I can get pregnant again. And she's got her hopes in these things. And of course, Rachel comes along, and look at verse 16. Basically, it says that when Jacob came out of the field in the evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, "You must come in to me, for I have surely hired you with my son's mandrakes." And he lay with her that night. And God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. You go, these people are crazy. What is going on? And of course, Rachel says, "Hey, I'll buy those off of you, and I'll give him to you tonight." And so she says, "Game on, girl." And Jacob comes in from a hard day's work. I'm sure he's tired. And she says, "Hey, come here. Guess what, honey? You're mine tonight. I just bought you." And I'm sure he's going, "Oh, boy, this is getting out of control." But here's the fascinating thing. God listened to Leah, it says there. Listened to her and her cries for another son. And I think, why didn't God just say, "Stop it. You guys are absolutely insane. You're out of your mind"? It's the grace of God. Because though at times we may not be walking all straight and narrow with him, and times that we are in the flesh, and times we are playing games even with what God has instilled in marriage, that God was faithful to his word to preserve and protect it. "Jacob, I will be with you, and I will bring you back to this place. You are the one that I'm going to work with in spite of you, Jacob. In spite of you." I think it's quite fascinating that the women are playing the games, scheming just like Jacob has done in his life. Isn't it interesting, husbands, that you can affect the outcome of things, the behavior of your wife as she watches your example? There's something to learn from him. Maybe I can pull stuff off too. The games begin. Then it filters down to the kids. And those things, they say, "Hey, mom and dad have been playing games, trying to get the upper hand and preserve themselves. Maybe that is the right way to handle life." And the games begin. Warren Wiersbe said this: "The schemer discovered the pain that people feel when their lives are selfishly manipulated by others." Very true. Why is the Bible giving us these things? Why is it giving us these things? The Bible just tells it frankly as it is. And I think that on one hand, we look at it and we think historically, the Bible is giving us the reason for the 12 tribes of Israel, how they came about. Spiritually, it's speaking to us simply that, hey, look at the mess you can make of things when you take matters into your own hands. Never a good thing. One man, one wife. That's what God intended. And here's why. Think about it. But also it reminds us the grace of God and our failures. That God is faithful to his plan to preserve and protect it in spite of who we are. Verse 18. "And Leah said, 'God has given me my wages because I have given my maid to my husband.' So she called his name Issachar. And Issachar there means hire. And Leah saw this fifth boy as a reward from God for her actions in giving her maid to Jacob." You think, wow, do we ever get to a place where we begin to not only justify our state, but begin to say this is the right way now to go? She's digging quite a deep hole. Verse 19, "And Leah conceived again and bore Jacob a sixth son. And Leah said, 'God has endowed me with a good endowment. Now my husband will dwell with me because I have borne him 6 sons.' So she called his name Zebulun, and Zebulun means dwelling, in hopes that once again Jacob would come and she would win his heart and the presence would be there. And then it tells us in verse 21, afterwards she bore a daughter and called her name Dinah. Her name means judgment. And Jacob had other daughters. Chapter 37, verse 35 tells us that. But Dinah is mentioned in preeminence because of chapter 34 and what's going to take place with her life. And so at the end of the third quarter in the Superboy Bowl, here is the score. You have Team Leah, 8. Leah's got 6 boys plus 1 girl, with Zilpah, her handmaid, having 2 boys. Team Rachel has 2, and those are by Bilhah, her servant. Team Family has goose egg, because everything has fallen apart, and at the expense of that, no one is winning in that reign. Verse 22, "Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb." God remembered. God remembered. God did not forget, as we think about it. "Lord, have you forgotten me? Give me children, Jacob, or I die." God has cursed me because I can't have kids. God remembered. God remembered. He was letting Rachel just run her course. Let her play her games. Let her get to the end of her road. Remember, she had bought those mandrakes, but evidently they didn't help because she didn't produce any kids. Leah did. Backfired on her. But when she got to the end of her road and she finally stopped looking to Jacob to fulfill her need and began to just come back to the Lord, God was listening to her prayer. God was ready to work. God listened to her, it says there, and opened her womb. And God remembers you. He remembers me. He knows the games that we can play with him. He's listening to the prayers of brokenness. And he might want to even speak to your heart this morning and say, look, I want to give life where there was once for such a long time just deadness. I want to breathe new life into you. I want to make your life fruitful. I want to take away the barrenness and give you the blessings that I have. But stop playing games. Stop playing games. Just own up and surrender and lay it all out and say, God, your will be done. I surrender what you see fit. If you want me in this place for the rest of my life, Lord, that's okay, because you're still my God. I'm not going to expect from you. I'm not going to follow you only because you bless. I'm going to follow you when there is no blessings. And I'm going to lift up my prayers to you continually. And in time, the Lord remembered. And he worked, and she bore a son. Verse 23, she conceived and bore a son and said, God has taken away my reproach. So she called his name Joseph and said, the Lord shall add to me another son. And the name Joseph is twofold. It means to take away, because that reproach of not bearing the son is taken away. But it also means to add to. That Rachel was already looking ahead. Hey, I'm not content with one boy. I want more. I want more. But this 11th son would be the key in the preservation of Israel, as we know the rest of the book. The 11th son, Joseph, would be a key in the whole mix of preserving the line. Yet the games aren't done, because we go on in verse 25, and Jacob begins to play games in the workplace. And it came to pass when Rachel had borne Joseph, that Jacob said to Laban, send me away that I may go to my own place and to my country. Give me my wives and my children for whom I have served you, and let me go, for you know my service which I have done for you. And Laban said to him, please stay, if I have found favor in your eyes, for I have learned by experience that the Lord has blessed me for your sake. And so after 14 years of service, Jacob says, hey, I got my wife and got my kids. I'm ready to go back home. Here's my 2 weeks' notice. I'm out of here, Uncle Laban. Uncle Laban says, wait a second, I'm not going to lose this good worker. Well, what can I do? What can I offer you? How can I pay? How can we make this right? Let's extend the contract. It wasn't because of the grandkids. It wasn't because of his own kids. He was a swindler himself. He was motivated by the material, and he thought, oh, the benefits of having him around. I've become so successful. Oh, I got to figure out a way to keep him to stick around. And Jacob had been quite a worker. He was incredible and prosperous in the things that he was doing, and Laban even saw that. And that, of course, that is a connection there. In verse 28, and he said, name me your wages and I will give it. What's it going to cost to keep you here? Maybe you've had that even at your own workplace. Okay, Jacob loves games. Let's play the game. Verse 29, and Jacob said to him, you know how I have served you and how your livestock has been with me. For what you had before I came was little, and it has increased to a great amount. The Lord has blessed you since my coming, and now when shall I also provide for my own house? And basically he's kind of buttering up the deal and saying, hey, look, before I came, look what you had. And now because of me, look what's happened. You know, I've prospered you, and come on, when can I run my own business? I want to run my own house. I want to go out on my own. In verse 31, Laban the businessman comes back to it and says, what shall I give you? Hey, I'm a wheeling dealing guy. Name your price, pal. And Jacob said, you shall not give me anything. Laban, you're not adding to any inheritance of mine. You're not going to be able to lay claim for what God is doing in my life. And I think that's an important factor to consider. He says, if you will do this thing for me, I will again feed and keep your flocks. And here's the deal that Jacob proposes. Let me pass through all your flocks today, removing from there all the speckled and spotted sheep, and all the brown ones among the lambs, and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and these shall be my wages. So my righteousness will answer for me in time to come, when the subject of my wages comes up before you. Everyone that is not speckled and spotted among the goats and brown among the lambs will be considered stolen if it is with me. What's with the speckled and spotted sheep? What's the big deal? Culturally, sheep were predominantly white. Goats were either black or brown. And so the speckled and the spotted brown sheep and goats were rare, and they were not very desirable. They were not very desirable, kind of the blemished of the flock, not the purebred, and so they didn't contribute a whole lot of value to things. And so Jacob says in verse 32, these will be my wages. And I had to stop as I was studying this, and I was reminded of another who said, I'll take the speckled, spotted, and stained. And these will be my wages, the great shepherd himself. You've been stained by the world. You've been speckled and spotted by life. You've been issued out the verdict that you're of no value, of no worth in the eyes of the world. And the true shepherd says, these will be my reward. And all the glory, that all goes to him. Verse 34, Laban basically says, oh, that it were according to your word, a.k.a. stupid kid, you don't know what you're getting into. The odds are in my favor. Sure, you want to do this? No problem. Verse 35, and so he removed, that is Laban, he removed that day the male goats that were speckled and spotted, all the female goats that were speckled and spotted, every one that had some white in it, and all the brown ones among the lambs, and gave them into the hands of his sons. Then he put 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flock. Laban separates his flock into two groups, the purebred and the spotted, and then he puts the speckled and spotted ones out of the picture, a 3 days' journey into the hands of his son. There's no way for mixing. There's no way for Jacob to pull one over. There's nothing. So Jacob comes and they're all white. Where's all the speckled and spotted ones? They're all white here. Well, guess what? You've been bamboozled by Laban again. And so he says, okay, I'll watch your sheep. But Jacob had something up his sleeve. Look at verse 37. Now Jacob took for himself rods of green poplar and of the almond and chestnut trees, peeled white strips in them, and exposed the white which was in the rods. And the rods which he had peeled he set before the flocks in the gutters, in the watering troughs where the flocks came to drink, so that they should conceive when they came to drink. So the flocks conceived before the rods, and the flocks brought forth streaks, speckled and spotted. And Jacob separated the lambs and made the flocks face towards the streaks and all the brown in the flock of Laban. But he did not put his own flock by themselves, and did not put them with Laban's flock. It came to pass, whenever the stronger livestock conceived, that Jacob placed rods before the eyes of the livestock in the gutters, that they might conceive among the rods. But when Jacob's flocks were feeble, he did not put them in, so the feebler were Laban's, and the stronger were Jacob. Here's Jacob's gain. Here's his game. It's the game of rods. And listen to what happened. Agriculturally, Jacob knew that there were dominant and recessive genes in animals. That even after watching for many generations, there would be some white sheep that reproduced, and every once in a while an off-colored sheep would be produced. And this recessive gene was in them for the speckled and spotted. And Jacob began this selective breeding process. So Jacob stripped off sections of the bark of these trees and set them before the strong ones of Laban's sheep where they came to drink, but not before the weaker ones. And the sight of these rods would put the sheep in heat, and as they mated there, the lambs born to the strong ones would come out streaked, speckled, and spotted, but the lambs born to the weaker ones were white. So Jacob would then separate things, separate the strong ones that were the spotted lambs by themselves. They were his reward. And then he'd leave the weaker white ones in Laban's flock. And over time, the speckled and spotted became stronger, not only in numbers, but in strength. It still proposes quite an interesting thing of what they think about these streaked or these rods. What's up with that? Possibly the thought was that these had some type of influence to determine the outcome of the birth. And it's not very far off from some of the things that people say today to try to determine the outcome of their birth. Some of it I researched a few things. WebMD said that if, women who are eating breakfast and high potassium meals, that they are more likely to bear a boy than those who have lower calorie. Though it's not completely, proven that they would have girls. Some say, well, it has to do with age or the time of ovulation and all these things that would cause a boy or a girl. But I think the one that I thought was really interesting was called the SALT test. And what you do is if you really want to figure out if you're going to have a boy or a girl, you take salt as your wife is sleeping. You put salt on her forehead. And when she wakes up, the first name that she says will determine the outcome of the sex. So when she wakes up and she says a male's name, you're going to have a boy. If she wakes up and she says a female's name, you're going to have a girl. You have quite a problem when she wakes up and says, "You idiot, what are you doing?" How do I pull this one off? People have all kinds of crazy ways to try to figure out, this is how I'm going to make sure I get a boy, type of thing. It's always been there. Ultimately, it wasn't Jacob's prenatal influences. It was God's sovereignty and God's work here. He was over all things.